Hi, everybody. Getting rolling with our Managing for Old Forest Conditions event, and thanks everybody who's joined. Today's presentation is by Tony D'Amato, author, researcher, and professor at UVM. And we first conceived of this presentation as we were revising the Old Forest ESTA category in the UVA program. And I think this presentation is going to be extremely relevant to that, and what work gets done on UVA enrolled lands, how lands are described in the program, and how the silviculture is described. With that said, today's discussion is not going to be focused in the UVA realm. It's really going to be focused on the science of old forests, and managing for old forest characteristics and using silviculture to achieve some of those conditions and associated values. So I know that there's a lot of really valuable questions that we've already received related to UVA and some of that, but we're not going to be digging deeply into that. With that said, please don't hold back from sharing the questions related to UVA and how some of this might be applied, because we'll take information gleaned from this presentation and those questions, and that can shape our conversations through the summer about how we better incorporate this into the forestry we do in Vermont and on UVA enrolled lands and in the standards of the program. This is our first run at a Teams Live event, and so we've all been exploring these different platforms, and some of them have various strengths and weaknesses. We used this one because we wanted to make sure that the platform could accommodate as many folks as have expressed interest in this, and with 130 folks registered, the other platforms weren't going to accommodate those numbers. So we wanted to not artificially limit the attendance with this event. But with that said, it's a new platform for both us and for a lot of you, I expect. So the way that this platform works, there's a bunch of the way that the audience engagement happens is that there's a chat feature up at the top of your screen, and you can post a question in the chat, and there's a little bit of delay for it to be seen by the full audience, but so be patient with that. But that's the way that you'll share questions with myself, with Tony, and your comments with the rest of the group. And so that's the way that'll happen. When we do the presentation today, we're going to hold questions until the end. We don't think that the presentation will run to 10:30, so there should be time for those questions. And just to exercise this option, if folks are interested, I'd invite you to just share some of your questions in the chat that you hope will be addressed either in this presentation or in future presentations, both to practice using the chat and for us to kind of gauge how we're doing in the conversation. Anything that's not addressed in the presentation, we can work to answer those questions after. A couple more logistics. This is approved for 1.5 SAF credits. I'll send a certificate out for attendees after, and though everybody here is going to get one of those certificates, anybody who wasn't able to attend, we are going to make it available on our Vermont Woods afterwards, and folks who view the webinar through that platform will be able to access UVM forestry credits. So I think with that, I'm going to pass it off to Tony and Tony's presentation. Huge thanks to Tony for pulling this together. There are multi-year courses taught on this subject, and we're going to get the benefit of all of that in an hour and a half, or some of that anyway. So thanks, and I'll pass it off to Tony.
Thanks, Keith, and folks, certainly let me know if you're not able to see my slides or if there are any issues here, but appreciate people logging on this morning. And when we put this on the calendar, I wasn't realizing it'd be a great way to take my mind off of that horrendous end of the Bruin seasons last night, but I'm glad I have something else to channel my energy into and really talk about a topic that I certainly enjoy discussing, both in terms of our understanding of old forests and what they mean from an ecological standpoint, but more importantly, how that understanding really can inform our silviculture and approaches for managing those systems. And so what I'll do this morning is really cover some bases that, again, I recognize for some of you will likely be reviewed, but kind of why do we get so excited about old forests? You know, what are those attributes and conditions that are found within them, and what does that mean in terms of their function and some of the values that they provide? And then get into kind of how do we actually go about managing for them. So independent of discussions around UVA and ESTAs, you know, in general, you know, if we have goals for a landscape that include increasing and accelerating and restoring the amount of old forest conditions that are out there, you know, what are some ways that we can use our existing strategies silviculturally, be thoughtful with conservation design, and do that in a way that allows us to achieve more old forests across the landscape. So as I mentioned, you know, what I'll start with is really talking about some of those conditions that we associate with old forests, and I'll really put a caveat out there that much of what I'll talk about today will be focused on northern hardwoods, mixed woods, kind of our common, you know, most abundant forest types in Vermont, as well as in other parts of the Northeast. But certainly many of the principles and the attributes that I discuss here really are kind of globally recognized as being found in old growth systems. And so there'll be a pretty heavy northern hardwood slant today, but nevertheless, this really will transcend to many other old forest systems. And so when we get into old forests, you know, something I think that's really worth bringing up, particularly, you know, old forests have come into our discussions now as really a desirable attribute for all acreages in all portions of the Northeast or all portions of Vermont. And I think it's important when we talk about old forests and old growth forests in particular that we need to acknowledge that there's an element of human bias in kind of how we think about old forests. And that is, you know, those of us that love trees and love forests, which I imagine is everyone logged on this morning. I think if we were asked what would we like to visit most in terms of a forest condition, I think we would say old growth. You know, we want to see a forest that hasn't been impacted by human, has big trees, has dead wood, you know, has this mystical, spiritual, ethereal characteristics to it. And so that's really a human perspective that we like those places. We're biased to those places. And unfortunately, sometimes that human bias towards a condition that we really like clouds our ability to be objective about the ecological values of that system and sometimes recognize that old forest is awesome for tons of things, but it isn't the only condition that exists out there, and that other forest conditions are also important. And so I think it's worth just putting that out there that we love old forests, they're great, but that's a human perception. We need to be objective about the science and objective about the ecological conditions. The other thing that's more important and that we can certainly back up with science as it relates to old forests is that we have a bit of a bias in terms of what we think they look like based on how we've documented them historically. And in particular, and those that have ever heard Charlie Cogbill talk about this, he certainly will emphasize this as well. We really tend to emphasize those attributes of old forests that are so different from anywhere else that we have experience with. And in particular, we really overemphasize this notion that every single square foot of an old landscape are these giant trees with no disturbance and essentially, you know, this wall-to-wall bomber individuals. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, of course, you know, who wouldn't want their picture next to this big white pine? Obviously, I'm pulling it here with a couple of our students. And you know, these photo opportunities, this ability to document something that really is, you know, fills us with awe. We haven't seen this before, or we don't see it very often generates this idea that old forests are big trees everywhere. And that's really not the case. I'm going to talk a lot about big trees today, and big trees are a big part of old forests, but they are not the only feature that's out there. And the other part of this is from a scientific standpoint, there's been a lot of work that's shown we actually have historically been a bit biased even in studying old forests, in that when we put plots out there in the landscape, of course we want those plots to fall within those big trees and those old conditions. And so sometimes we're actually overrepresenting a condition on the landscape that, even though it might be an old ecosystem, it's not wall-to-wall big old trees. There's a lot of variability happening out there. And so just to kind of back that up a bit with our one example for New England, at least, of kind of documentation of an old growth landscape. Many are familiar with the Pisgah Forest in southern New Hampshire, and that really was kind of the last remaining large block of old growth in southern New England. And the Harvard Forest did quite a bit of work there in the early 1900s, documenting the conditions across that landscape in terms of forest structure. And so what we're looking at here is just kind of 2 transects across that landscape and showing the basal area over space for 2 of those different transects. And so one thing that's worth pointing out is that there are some pretty amazing parts of that landscape. 500 square feet of basal area. We're getting into Douglas fir size numbers here, but that's a very localized scale, right? If I put a plot in this group of trees, I'm going to get a very high number, whether it's carbon or for basal area. But if you look at the pattern, there's actually a lot of variation across that landscape. There are places that were disturbed that didn't have as big of trees. They're either recovering from disturbance or just happen to have edaphic conditions that can't grow giant trees. And so even though this person's smiling next to the big trees, this poor field technician had to get the photo in the recent gap, right? So the same scenario happening out there. And so the reason I'm bringing this up is that big trees are important in old forests, but that variation is even more important. There's a lot of variability happening throughout that region. So when we look at Vermont and think about, how much of Vermont should be old forest, it's often worth reflecting upon, what naturally occurred, prior to kind of mass change to the landscape by Europeans. Certainly there was impact across that landscape by the Abenaki and other indigenous peoples in the region, but we know kind of the most significant change to old forest was likely occurring following mass clearing and so forth of the landscape. And so many of you are hopefully familiar with this great work that Craig Lorimer and Al White did in the early 2000s. But for different forest types in the Northeast, they really looked at kind of what we know about the rotation period for stand leveling, stand replacing disturbances, and what does that mean in terms of the different proportions of the landscape that might be in different age class scenarios. And so I have 2 different columns here. One assuming kind of an average 500-year rotation for a stand replacing event. So every 500 years, a given point in the landscape is totally wiped out. And so that's assuming kind of a rotation period of 1,000 years for fire. We do call our forest the asbestos forest for a reason, as well as a 1,000-year return interval for stand replacing wind. And then I have another scenario here that has a little bit longer rotation period, although I would argue, given climate change, we should probably focus on this more liberal scenario. And so based on kind of simulating what would our forest look like without us here and just disturbance operating across that landscape, what they generally found is that a fairly small proportion would be in, and this is for northern hardwoods, in this young forest stage, whereas a large proportion would be kind of in some sort of old condition, either old even-aged, this transition from old even-aged into uneven-aged stands, so likely strongly 2 cohort, ultimately 3 cohort stands, and then 40% likely in this old uneven age. And so when folks wonder why we're going to talk about mature forest and managing for old forest across the landscape, part of it is that we know it was a big part of our region. Given our disturbance regimes, old forests were quite common and certainly not as common today. And if we were to translate this to spruce fir, as well as translate it to pine barrens and other communities, the younger forest proportion goes up quite a bit, just given the return intervals for disturbance in those forests is much more frequent. And particularly with coastal pine barrens and pine barrens in general, we know there was quite a bit of indigenous burning in those areas, although we certainly have a horrendous estimate of kind of what the extent was of that historically in the region. So if I'm going to look at managing for old forest conditions, and I'm going to get into talking about the structures that define these forests, we want to understand, well, what really generated that condition? Kind of what is the prevailing disturbance regime, and what did that result in terms of the sizes of trees, the gaps distribution, the amount of dead wood? And so from an ecological silvicultural standpoint, really what we want to do is, to the best of our ability, get a good understanding of what is the natural disturbance regime that characterized old forest and really led to kind of the conditions that we today kind of view as the hallmark of an old growth stand or an old forest system. And so some of the best work we have for kind of large old growth patches in New England are from northern Maine, and even though it's northern Maine, it's actually fairly dominated by nice northern hardwood stands in the Big Reed Forest Preserve, and some work that Sean Fravor did where he reconstructed very extensively across this landscape what the disturbance dynamics were in these forests historically. And so what we're looking at here is just a percentage of the landscape disturbed in a given decade, back constructed in time. And so what we see, which is not unique to Maine, this is seen really throughout the range of northern hardwoods and mixed woods, is that the average disturbance rate in these forests, without us around, was about 10%, often up to 20% per decade of the canopies getting disturbed. So basically mortality events, trees dying. but that we noticed that even though there's these low kind of background rates of mortality, there are these periods where over 20%, sometimes up to 30% of the canopy are being disturbed. And so what this really reflects is that even though many of us have often had this bias that this old forest is this pristine, equilibrium state where nothing is occurring, really, it couldn't be further from the truth. These ecosystems are experiencing fairly frequent tree death, and often this fairly frequent low severity disturbance is being punctuated by these what we call mesoscale events where 30–40% of the canopy is being disturbed, and really creating these conditions that are quite important for sustaining species like yellow birch. And those of you that have been to old growth forests, you always see some pretty big bomber old yellow birch, and they didn't get there by recruiting in the shade, right? They basically are being kind of introduced and maintained in that system via these events. And so if I want to develop a silvicultural system for old growth in old forest, this is giving me at least some baseline to draw upon, and I'll return to that as we get into management regimes. But before I do that, I want to talk about, this disturbance regime. What does that mean in terms of what we actually associate with old forests? And so if we're going to take Vermont's forests as they exist today and move those into an old forest state, what are some of the attributes that we're looking to create and that would allow us to say, yes, now I'm getting into that range that corresponds with what we've seen elsewhere. So given silviculturists, you have to start talking about diameter distributions first. For some of you, it always gives you those flashbacks to those days with chalkboard J distributions with your instructor. But the diameter distribution is pretty important to think about in terms of old growth forests, because it really illustrates some important attributes. And so there's been a lot of work looking at old forests and looking at kind of the range of tree sizes and tree size distributions that are characteristic of old forests. And what they've found is there is some variability in the general curve form that we see in old forests. But more often than not, what's generally seen is what we call this rotated sigmoid curve, which again, I know many of you are familiar with, where instead of having that constant Q factor, J-shaped curve, negative exponential curve, instead, we see this curve here where we actually have this kind of saddle or flat portion. So we get this rotated sigmoid distribution. And so this was first documented by Goff and West in the Midwest. Bill Leake certainly has documented it quite often in natural stands, and Craig Lorimer as well in the Lake States. And so it's not certainly one study. It's really been proven many times over. And it makes a lot of biological sense in that, left on their own, old forests, kind of as they develop, there's kind of three different tree sizes distributions in that stand that are experiencing very different processes that result in this curve form. And so the first is if we assume that forest is experiencing disturbance over time, and there are these gaps with lots of trees regenerating, in those gaps and in those sapling sized trees, we're going to have very, very high rates of mortality, right? So that steep portion of this curve. At the same time, we have other parts of the stand that are kind of mid canopy or individuals that are going to be much more vigorous. They're not exposed to the extremes that these dominant trees are. And in those cases, they tend to have low mortality rates, which results in this flat portion of the curve. And then as we get into the big diameter trees, both due to the fact that those big diameter trees have accumulated disease and injury and all those things that happen over centuries in a forest, as well as the fact that those trees are exposed to the extremes in that forest, those tend to have very high mortality rates. And so the overall end result is this distribution form, right? And if I were to translate that into mortality rates, we get this U-shaped mortality rate. So small size classes have a high rate, intermediate size classes have a lower rate, and then big classes have a high rate again, right? So kind of showing that U-shaped curve. And so the students of Arbogast and J-shaped curves are probably already squinting at this a bit and realizing that when it comes to our management in our marking guides, essentially what we've done with those is truncate out that kind of high risk big tree component, right? We basically stop at some max diameter, depending on the guide you use or how you're using DBQ type approaches. And essentially we're taking out that high risk component that really, is a big part of how we think of old growth forests. There are trees being out there that are growing well beyond kind of what we would view as large saw log size classes. And as a result, are much more high risk for mortality, which is of course a natural and important process in these systems. So one of the key attributes that I'll keep referring back to throughout this presentation is that there's been a lot of work synthesizing kind of commonalities across old forests in temperate regions, including the Northeast US. And what they've found, whether it's work that Manomet's done, Bill Keaton's certainly done some work on this as well, is that old forests generally have on average 12 big trees per acre, right? And some of you might be saying, well, I manage stands that have 12 20-inch trees per acre. But the key difference is that these are big trees that are out there for good, right? And so we're going to keep coming back to that. But this idea of kind of large trees and large trees out there to live out their lifespan. So besides large living, we also certainly know there's a lot of large dead wood in old forest systems. And so allowing those large trees to live out their lifespan, as well as understanding that these are forests that are experiencing disturbances over centuries, at very fine scales, results in old forests generally having a very high abundance of dead wood, particularly large dead wood, and a diversity of decay classes, right? So not just kind of all the same vintage of dead wood, but old logs, new logs, a whole range of sizes, but certainly representing those canopy trees. And so there's been some work looking at Deadwood Abundance. Actually, Bill Patterson did quite a bit of early work on this in New Hampshire, but looking at kind of what do we see for kind of the volume of dead wood in old growth stands relative to second growth stands that haven't been managed. And then I've actually put in stands that have been managed with selection systems, primarily single tree selection, just as a point of contrast. And so what we generally see is that, in old growth stands, we have, often, anywhere from, 12 to 15 cords per acre, of dead wood on the ground, whereas in second growth stands, certainly it's far less than that. And then stands managed with selection, we actually see there tends to be kind of an intermediate level, partly due to just kind of utilization standards, people leaving material out there and so forth, as well as just damage leading to mortality in some cases. And so and these stands are a bit closer, but certainly well below what we see in old growth. And snags, so standing dead trees, are a bit different story. First off, there's a tremendous range of what's been documented in terms of snag basal areas in old growth. And part of that is, as opposed to a log, which is there on the ground and sits around for a long time, snags are highly variable. Some will fall, a couple of days after they're created. Others will stand for decades. And so there's a lot of variation there. But what we know is that when we use our traditional marking rules, which is to take out trees like this on the right, trees like this on the left, that are kind of low risk, UGGs, poor vigor, that's, really trying to purge the stand of that condition, it really diminishes kind of the potential for future snags on those sites. And so when we compare stands managed with single tree selection, and Laura Kennefick and Ralph Nyland really nicely demonstrated this, those stands tend to have much lower amounts of cavity trees and snags relative to both old growth stands, but also unmanaged stands, which really have a lot of dead trees from self-thinning, right? So not the most functional snags, but nevertheless more of them. So why should we care about dead wood? This is where folks start groaning, and then now he's going to keep talking about dead wood. Dead wood is super important, and I would argue that we're a bit behind other parts of the world in truly understanding, what uses dead wood and why we should care about dead wood in our forests. And really, we can take some cues from Europe and Phytoscandia and those regions where there's a tremendous amount of focus, partially because they don't have a lot of dead wood in their forest to begin with, around what are those species that really depend on dead wood for at least one, if not their one portion, if not their entire portion of their life cycle. And so these are species we call saprophytic species. And when we look at old forests, because there's such a diversity of deadwood substrates, as well as a high abundance of deadwood substrates in these ecosystems, we tend to see the highest abundance of many of these saprophytic species, whether it's corticoid fungi, certain bark beetles, as well as even pine martens, that rely on these portions of the ecosystem. And so, as much as we've kind of hung our hat on foresters for the birds, if we can do foresters for the beetles next, that might be a good opportunity. And what we might start getting into is like some of these public service campaigns they've been doing in Germany around this. I think his name is Becky the beetle, that they're really trying to understand, that they highlight as creating this wild condition out there. And so certainly a big part of our forest, and something we know so little about in terms of its importance for saprophytic species. All right, so I'm done with deadwood for now, but we are not off the hook fully, but I'll get back to the living. And another attribute that we think of with old forests is that, again, keep remembering that historic disturbance regime, lots of gap scale disturbances, regularly occurring over time. And so what that often generates in terms of the conditions of old forests is that we have multiple canopy layers, so this vertical variability, which really reflects both kind of a long-term stratification and differentiation, between canopy layers, as well as within canopy layers, and also these gaps. You can see this large gap, these mature trees next to that large gap, another small gap. So creating kind of that variable condition, both vertically, but also importantly, horizontally, so having that heterogeneity in kind of the density of trees. We're not talking about wall-to-wall big trees. There's a lot of variation out there. And so those of you that are interested in kind of interior, songbirds, wood warblers species, many of the habitats that they're gleaning into in terms of kind of these dense canopy layers, this vertical and horizontal variability, really is most abundant in old forest systems. And so species like cerulean warblers, Swainson's thrush, the work that has looked at those and compared old forests to kind of mature forests and young forests have really shown those species, are much more abundant in old forests because they're responding to this structure that's out there. And so just to kind of highlight that spatial variability, what you're looking at here on the right side is a stem mapped plot from the Bowl natural area in the White Mountains, so a large old growth area. And the size of these dots corresponds to the diameter of the trees. And so again, you're not seeing wall-to-wall big trees, right? That notion that old forest is wall-to-wall big trees really is a bias. It's not supported via the data that we collect. And what we see here instead is that, yes, there are big trees, and there's groups of big trees, there's scattered big trees, but you also see a lot of kind of medium-sized trees. You see areas that the trees are too small to be measured, so these are recent gaps. And so really highlighting that heterogeneity and spatial arrangement that characterizes these systems, and is critical for supporting what we call kind of a niche-rich space. So when we get into species conservation and the value of old forests for species conservation, very rarely do we have species currently in the landscape that we say this is only found in old growth. Oftentimes instead, what we say, as I was just describing with cerulean warblers, their abundance is higher in old growth than it might be in other ecosystems. And if we were to kind of characterize the traits, particularly of plant species, as well as cryptogams and lichens and mosses that are most abundant in old forests relative to other forest conditions, these tend to be species that really take a long time to recover following intensive disturbances like us clearing the landscape for agriculture. And so even though we might not think of squirrel corn, as a species that, is rare in the landscape, it's very dispersal limited, right? Ants, are dispersing those seeds. We have other species like, Mediola that is, highly clonal. So if you eliminate a population of that species, it takes a long time for it to recolonize and build up again. And so in old forests, we often find these species with very limited dispersal potential, like lichens, like Loberia pulmonaria that you see here, this moss here, Necra pendata. Both of those, they're not going to kind of recolonize a clear cut very rapidly. And so, we tend to associate some of these species being at higher abundance in old forests. And then the other thing that's in high abundance from a unique attribute perspective linked to plant species is that many of the features that we associate with old forests aren't just big trees, but also quite complex tree structures. And so this crown of this hemlock is a good example. It's from an old growth stand in Western Massachusetts. And what you see here is, this crown really is showing its age in terms of the battle wounds it has from ice and wind and all these things that have occurred over the decades. And so, really trying to kind of respond to that and recover from that has generated this quite complex crown structure that's quite important for habitat. Similarly, the bark structures we get on trees over time as they get older are quite unique. And so these are things that you just can't create overnight in a forest. And so these are the features that we associate with old systems. So why are we talking about old forests so much today? I would say that the primary reason, historically, it was because we know they are important for biodiversity, and that was really the thrust of a lot of the work in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s around managing for old forest conditions. But I would argue that carbon has really kind of created this platform where old forests have become kind of the main focus for certain objectives and groups and agendas around kind of what our forests should look like, and for good reason. When we think of old forests, they are tremendous as it relates to their contribution to mitigating greenhouse gas emissions in the form of carbon storage. And this diagram here is just kind of showing, over forest development. If we follow this brown, as it gets darker, we're kind of getting into kind of higher levels of storage. And so as the forest grows, and as trees get bigger and they accumulate biomass, and we accumulate, dead necromass, and we accumulate forest soil carbon, we know that, it's been proven the world over that as forests get older, carbon storage goes up, right? There's nothing better for carbon storage in the landscape than in terms of living organisms than big old forest. The flip side of that, and I think this is where things get confusing for some, is that Storage is one aspect of it, but the rate at which carbon gets pulled out of the atmosphere, right, is sequestration. And so we know that stand growth, and this has been proven for over a century, it tends to peak kind of in these kind of intermediate stages. So anywhere between ages 30 to 60, we see kind of a peak in net permanent productivity, at least in our forests. So this is where we see kind of the peak rates of sequestration. Nevertheless, this forest is still fixing carbon, but it's not fixing it as fast a rate, and there's more decomposition and other things occurring out there that are counterbalancing that, and respiration. That old forests are still fixing carbon, but not as fast a rate. And so when we think about the value of old forests and carbon, the indisputable fact is that big old trees, old forests are the best thing for carbon storage. Sequestration, we also know, they're doing it, but other forest systems are a bit more equipped for that. The reason we need a balance. But one thing that's quite interesting is that now that we've looked more at carbon in forests, this big tree component, whether it's in old growth forests or even managed forests, when you're looking at your forest from a carbon perspective, there's been a lot of work that included not just old growth stands, but also second growth stands. And they show that the big trees in your stand, and what I'm talking about is that the top 1% of trees in your stand in terms of diameter really carry a huge proportion, carry the most weight, my terrible pun there, of the carbon stored in that stand. So 20 to 50% of all of the carbon in this picture here, or all the carbon in this picture here above ground, is contained in these large trees, right? And those, again, that are students of forest measurements and biometrics, should be no surprise. Biomass increment at the tree level actually increases over time. That rate increases over time, so you're kind of gaining a lot at that individual tree level. And so those large trees are really important for carbon stocks. The last thing I'll speak to before we get into the management piece is that beyond looking at carbon storage, we also certainly are not just factoring mitigation, but also adaptation to global change. And so again, much of the emphasis on managing for old forests and why we should value old forests historically really is focused on biodiversity conservation, right? Can we bring back this forest type that was so important? And so if I list here, some of the reasons why we like old forests for biodiversity conservation, again, many of the attributes we've just talked about. There's a range of sizes, there's a lot of dead wood out there, and a range of decay classes, variability in spatial distributions, et cetera. All those things are creating kind of this habitat rich environment. But if we look at those habitats in the context of global change, they also provide a lot of mechanisms for that forest both to kind of minimize vulnerability. So by having a diversity of species and tree sizes, we don't have kind of one single flavor out there for that disturbance to impact, right? So there's some reduced vulnerability because of that, as well as by having these well-developed understory layers, advanced regeneration, dead wood, large trees. There's many ways for that forest to both experience disturbance and then recover from disturbance. So kind of building in some of those mechanisms or these response pathways to disturbance. And so another function of old forest beyond biodiversity conservation, carbon storage, is that these old forest attributes do have relationships directly with some of the factors we're trying to manage for in terms of adaptation to climate change. All right. Now, how do we create this stuff? So most of us are, if we're looking out our window, probably not looking at an old forest system. So we know, I've just talked a lot about how great it is, and there's many that certainly are talking about we need more of it across the landscape. And so how do we go about doing that? And so I'm going to talk first about kind of some of the basic kind of where we're at in Vermont. If you don't believe that you're not seeing old forest everywhere, I'll talk a little bit about kind of the current state of our forest, and then get into kind of some different approaches broadly, so kind of passive approaches versus active approaches, and then get into in the active approach realm, kind of brass tacks, silvicultural approaches we might actually use to manipulate systems and generate old forest conditions. How are we currently doing on the old forest front in Vermont? Well, given, depending on how you look at it, at least 60% of our landscape was old forest before we really obliterated that. We're doing a pretty poor job. Most of our forests right now are kind of in that 60 to 100-year-old age class. There's certainly exceptions, but those that need data to prove these types of statements. This is just based on FIA plots, so obviously not a continuous coverage of all forests in Vermont or the Northeast. But we can generally see here is those that can differentiate colors, the yellow and green, really corresponding to these 50 to 100-year-old age forests. Shouldn't be surprised, those that know our land use history, and those needing at least some verification that this data makes sense. If you look at northern Maine, you notice you start picking up a lot of purples and blues where there's much more active management. So even younger forest conditions up there. And so, our forests are middle age, you might say, kind of in this mature forest stage, but certainly largely even aged, in some cases borderline too aged, and very different than what was kind of our historic kind of landscape. And so again, why we are talking about old forests today, and certainly thinking about ways to incentivize people to manage for this condition. I will also argue, I will talk about old forests, today for the rest of this presentation, staying consistent with the theme here, but we also are lacking a lot of young, complex young forests in the landscape too. And so creating young forest conditions that have, some scattered mature trees, down wood within them, and some of those complexes that large beaver flowages and other things used to create in the landscape. Obviously, we don't allow that to develop anymore in our region. And so I'll be talking about mature forest today, but we also need to emphasize young forests are also quite lacking, particularly complex young forests in our region. And so both ends of that spectrum need some attention. So thankfully, there are people that are thinking about both ends of the spectrum. And so I want to kind of put this in context with kind of regional visions that folks have to increase the amount of old forest out there. And I recognize that old forest can happen haphazardly by just not managing everywhere. But if we really want to achieve some of these goals, you need to be thoughtful with your planning and really commit to the fact that this place is not going to be disturbed, and we want to make sure that we're protecting that. And so at the state level, those that are logging in from Vermont today, hopefully all are familiar with the Vermont Conservation Design, this great visionary idea for the state to really protect kind of this amazing green infrastructure that Vermont's been blessed with in terms of these large forest blocks and the different attributes that are within them. And so if we look at kind of Vermont Conservation Design, there are targets both for old forest as well as for young forest, again, recognizing the importance as well as the general lack of those conditions in our landscape. And in the context of Vermont Conservation Design, really looking at these, these high priority blocks and allocating a portion of those high priority blocks for old forest. And so kind of 9%, at least based on the last update I've received on this, of the entire landscape, in old forest condition, with 15% of those high priority blocks being in that condition. And again, people can certainly fill me in on any changes in that thinking when we get into the discussions here. But predating Vermont Conservation Design, there was kind of a broader call that remains being discussed, Wildlands and Woodlands by Harvard Forest, that just like Vermont Conservation Design recognizes that independent of whether it's old forest, young forest, sugar maple forest, or spruce fir forest, the most important thing we can do in general in the Northeast is keep forest, right? And then we can argue about how to manage it. And so the underlying premise of Wildlands and Woodlands, as many of you know, is just to protect forests with easements and other ways to minimize development and loss of forest, something unfortunately we haven't been too successful in the past decade. And so as part of that initial vision, really, they argued that, a large portion of these woodlands would be managed and could include old forest management, but there'd be 7% of the landscape set aside as wildlands that would really kind of passively develop some of these old forest conditions, over time under the influence of natural disturbance. And I've kind of updated that depending on how the 30 by 30 vision by Biden's administration and others rolls out, that we might actually have even a bigger portion of the region being permanently protected from management to achieve that 30% conserved by 2030 vision that's happening out there. So just to be aware of that as one other looming policy. But both of these really view the achievement of old forests as kind of a passive thing. We were thoughtful about where we designate it, but then we basically kind of protect it and then allow it to really develop old forest in the zone. There is some recognition of kind of restorative management and potentially in some small areas in Vermont Conservation Design, but in general, it's really arguing for just passively allowing these forests to become old on their own. And so what I will argue, and kind of why we're here today, or why I'm talking about this, is that passive management really can't be the only way we do this. And just first off, we know how abundant old forest conditions were in Vermont, and so even allowing 9% of the landscape to passively achieve that, there are many other acres that need to get there too in terms of some of these conditions that really can't wait for us to allow them to get there on their own. And so I always like this figure that John Hagan and Andy Whitman put together years ago, just kind of showing kind of forest development with age. And most of our forests are sitting here right now, right? Kind of this mature forest stage. And And we know that, really they're just starting to get into the zone where they're going to develop some of those attributes that we associate with old forests. Initially might be a few big trees fall, and then ultimately, by the time they're 200, 250, 300 years old, they're getting into some of those conditions that we consider old growth. But given the urgency both of global change, the urgency of species needs, there's a potential with active management in some places to shorten this time frame. Can we actually accelerate that growth? Likewise, passive, assuming we can kind of lock up Vermont and just allow it to rewild and become old forest again, kind of ignores what we know about this landscape, and that we've already had a huge impact and really influenced the current successional and stand developmental trajectory of a lot of places, such that they're not going to become this old, complex, beautiful forest on their own, even though we kind of might have that bias. Whether it's an area like this, where unfortunately, due to beech bark disease and past management, there's never a tree in this forest that's given the dominance of beech that's going to get over 16 inches in diameter, unless one or two might survive that. And so, if I really want to restore big trees, I might want to start favoring other species on that site. Likewise, we've done wonderful things like this, in the 20s and 30s, create plantations in places, and then totally walk away from them for the next 50 years. That if I leave that forest on its own, as much as I'm not one to say if the forest can definitely take care of themselves, but this forest is really not set in a good trajectory to develop big old trees and have the stability mechanically to do that. And so, intervention in those places as well as elsewhere might allow us to accelerate that. Then the final piece, and this really gets to some of these broader discussions that old forest is the only way, and as a result, we should never harvest again and rewild as much as we can of the Northeast, is that it's a pretty selfish argument in that, we all consume wood products every day. And I would argue that, we all should reduce the amount of wood products we consume every day, but nevertheless, we are still consuming them and will continue to do that. And so unless we, basically stop consuming wood products, which I would argue is not a good idea for other reasons, we need to actually, if in any case, actually increase the amount of wood production we're doing on our landscape relative to what we currently are, so we can start carrying some of our fair share. And so passively just setting aside the entire landscape, for what old forest really is kind of a NIMBY type argument, because we're still using wood products from elsewhere and often from places that aren't being managed as well as our forests. And so active management is important in general, but certainly for achieving these objectives. So what I'm going to do is get into kind of how do we actually actively manage and accelerate some of these old forest conditions. And the way I'm going to do that is kind of first start off by referring back to some of those attributes that we associate with old forests, and then linking them with silvicultural practices. And again, I always joke, my office is my office is in my house now, but when I'm on campus, my office is not in the medical school, because silviculture, we're not really doing anything groundbreaking, right, on a daily basis. We're kind of just repackaging these really great tools that have been developed over the centuries for new objectives. And so what you'll see is that I'm going to take a lot of kind of classic silvicultural approaches and just tie them to some of these objectives and kind of using our knowledge on the ground on how to actually achieve them. So what I'll do for this is kind of each slide is going to have a similar format, and that I'll have this desired forest attribute, and in much of this we'll draw from some of the synthesis work that Bill Keaton did, and then followed up by Jürgen Bahus and others, and kind of expand upon that in kind of a broader silvicultural realm to really highlight, if we have a given desired attribute for old forest, kind of how do we get to that based on what we view as some I think pretty reasonable benchmarks based on what we understand in these ecosystems. And I do have to point out that Craig Lorimer in particular from University of Wisconsin really did a lot of pioneering work to sort a lot of this out for northern hardwood systems. And so the first one we're going to talk about is we want big trees. And again, all of us that have forestry degrees know how to create big trees. You're reducing density, you're allocating resources to the trees with the highest potential growth. And many years ago, really some of the first work on restoring old growth in northern hardwoods was developed by Craig Lorimer and a graduate student, where basically they really highlighted the value of using crown thinning. If you're taking a 70 to 100-year-old stand and you want to increase the big tree component and get it there in a much faster time frame than passive management will get you, selecting, as we would recommend for commercial purposes, 40 to 60 dominant codominant trees and releasing those, with crown release is going to accelerate that large tree component. And so our target, over time is we want 12 trees per acre, right? That are DBH greater than 20 inches. And so this initial density of crop trees really is acknowledging that we might go back out there and harvest things and commercially utilize them, but we're also acknowledging that some of these trees are going to die, which all of us have to recalibrate our brain is not a bad thing, right? If we're managing for old forest. And even some of these trees are going to die by our hand, but left out in the site and created as future dead wood in that ecosystem. And so, really trying to accelerate that big tree component using crown thinning and doing it on select individuals as we would do anyway in the context of timber production. And then those that are already looking at the square footage of basal area and worrying about that, what I'll get into as we start putting this all together is that oftentimes this is, even though we're talking about this basal area, it's kind of a micro stand within a larger complex of different conditions we're creating. And so there might be high stocking areas and low stocking areas that generate a much lower overall stand level average, but there's certainly in these places where we're thinning, this is what we're shooting for. So if I want a large tree density out there that's more than I have today, a key part and a real difference of thinking as it relates to how we traditionally have been approaching uneven age management in our forests is that we are marking to leave big stuff and really, marking trees as legacies that will live out their lifespan. So oftentimes those max diameters we choose as part of selection systems are based on our human rotation. What's the tree level rotation we have out there? We don't want trees to live beyond a certain size, which we assume correlates to a certain tree level age. But in the case of growing big trees, we need to accept that we want at least 12 big trees per acre to be out there to live out their lifespan. They're going to do their thing. They're going to go when it's time to go, but we're not going to have much involvement in that other than being the ones that decided that they could stick around a little bit longer than other things. And so we're pretty well versed in doing this with even age methods, so we've turned a lot of our even age methods into 2-age methods. So clear cutting with reserves, shelter with reserves, so we can leave a few trees behind. We do this far less with uneven age approaches. And so again, it's a different way of thinking where we're taking individuals that historically might be viewed as cull and leaving those out there for future large trees. And so what do we want? We want big trees. So if they're already out there, like this beautiful yellow birch, and Kevin's next to here, that's a bonus. But certainly choosing individuals that already have some ecological values that they can see, whether it's existing cavities, bark furrows, things that have really high biological value, but might have very low economic value. What a win-win, right? The more you can do this with cull, the better, right? Certainly choosing species that are underrepresented, I would pick on red spruce, right? A species that we know is much more abundant across our landscape. So once you leave one behind, we all know what happens, right? We start gaining more red spruce by having that seed source there. And also leaving behind individuals that are built to last, both in terms of species. I already picked on beech a little bit. If all you're leaving is beech, beech is great, right? For food source and so forth. It's a challenge in other reasons, but I'm trying to be more neutral on it. But it's not a tree that's going to grow to be 30 inches in diameter. And so if that's all you're leaving, you're really not factoring in kind of what's being left behind. And the same goes for these trees right here. I always like getting these photos because I know it's a glimmer in time that this tree is going to stand. These trees are not built to last architecturally, and so leaving that behind as your only leaf trees is not going to satisfy that. And then the final piece that's a bit different is that we need to let either future foresters, landowners know, that these trees are left out there in perpetuity. And so documenting those trees, you don't have to go as far as kind of painting leaf on it, but nevertheless ways both to communicate with the operators on that site as well as over time communicate that these are legacy trees that are there to live out their lifespan. So those that are, again, starting to get heartburn already, like, oh, I'm leaving more out there, what's that going to mean? Part of that heartburn, and I certainly, share your pain, has to do with the fact that, we're trained when it comes to thinking about residual basal areas to really think of those residual basal areas that maximize both stand and individual tree level growth and development, right? And so when we look at our marking guides, so I've just put Arbogast up here in black, where that marking guide ends, really that max diameter is corresponding again to where we're getting into some very high risk tree sizes, as well as the overall kind of height of this marking guide is corresponding to a stocking level that we view as being kind of optimal for kind of balancing site occupancy and individual tree development. And so when we add in these legacy trees, we're really talking about adding in 15 to 20 square feet of basal area right into that stand. And again, I will get at this later, but it doesn't have to be everywhere, right? We're kind of often putting this into certain portions of the stand. But nevertheless, both from as was talked about, we're not going to get into policies too much today, but if you have to file a plan with a given stocking guide and you're now exceeding max diameters or you're exceeding kind of the stocking in large size classes, that's not a bad thing when it comes to old forest. And so we need to break out of that mindset in terms of, well, you have to have a max diameter, or your max diameter is, too large relative to, what Leekern Island or Arbogast says. The reason for that is those marking guides are really developed with kind of more of a kind of production and wood products perspective. And so, as we bring in this legacy retention, we have to recalibrate those tools. Similarly, we look at our stocking guide again, we have this beeline here, but if I add in that basal area that we should be carrying in general of legacy trees, when we're managing these stands, we actually kind of create this new almost, call it an L line, the legacy line that, we don't want to be dropping below this, because when we do that, we're kind of eroding kind of our capacity to carry some of those trees in the site. And so really factoring that in terms of, what that means for the stocking of that site and those long-term options. All right, on to Deadwood. Just when you thought you were done with me on my Deadwood soapbox, we do want more Deadwood in our forests, right? So as I mentioned, we often see 12 to 15 cords per acre in old growth systems. Our forests tend to have 2 to 4 cords per acre, in a typical second growth stand. So we're pretty far off from that. But I think it's also naive to say, well, we'll go out there tomorrow and create all that dead wood, right? It's not going to work for many reasons, both economic, but even ecologically. I'll talk in a moment about why that's not a good idea. And so, what we might do is have some kind of benchmark target that isn't fully restoring what we associate with old forest, but maybe, half or 60% of old growth levels. And so kind of shooting for targets that are a bit more reasonable. And so just like silviculture, is about living trees, morticulture is about being thoughtful and having long-term planning for dead trees. And so trying to get us kind of up a bit towards what we know are associated with old forest, one quick way to do that is to fell and leave, 8 to 10 large diameter trees. And this can be those trees and should be those trees that you've kind of marked as your crop trees and crop tree release. Can be that kind of ecological crop you're growing out there for that big tree component. And then over time, what we would hope we would achieve both through that initial pulse, but also, felling trees, natural mortality occurring, that kind of that initial slug, which is going to give you another, 3 to 4 cords per acre on the ground, plus what's already out there, that we start kind of getting close to 50% of what we associate with these old forest systems. And I know it's a lot of wood to leave on the ground, but certainly is what we know is quite important in these ecosystems. In terms of cavity trees and snags, I've really have changed my perspective on those. We can definitely create snags and girdle trees, and it's certainly a very, very quick way to create a standing dead tree. But when it comes to functional cavity trees and functional snags, what we tend to find is that, cavity trees are good cavity trees for a reason, and that is because that tree kind of, declined naturally on the site. Already had some decay and rot in it, and so obviously those cavity nesters and those species kind of, preferentially are going after the individual. And so, I'm much more of a proponent of just leaving trees out there and letting them die on their own as a way to create snags. But nevertheless, if you do want to kind of bump up the snag volume, I think we all know how to do that. Likewise, for creating deadwood on the ground, we definitely know how to do that as well. We just don't attach the hitch to those trees. And so cutting and leaving is one way we can do this, but also those familiar with Bill Keaton's work, we can also pull those trees over if economics and operations would allow, and certainly the benefit of that is it's giving you a tip-up mound, but obviously not everyone can economically pull that off on a site. So as I said, morticulture is the zombie brother, I guess, of silviculture, kind of the dead portions of what we're managing for. And so because of that, we need to be thoughtful about how we are managing for deadwood over time. We can't just create this pulse of deadwood, today and say, yep, that stand is on its way to old forest and never come back into it, because it really ignores how old forest and old forest dead wood pools really develop over time. And the way those develop over time is that we have these disturbances that create a pulse of dead wood out there. 10 years later, we have another disturbance that creates another pulse of dead wood. And over time, what we get is what we're seeing here on the right. We call this deadwood continuum. And you can see, just by the legacy of these logs, like different ages of disturbance that have created, really well-decayed wood, fairly fresh wood, in a whole range of conditions across that site. And so if all I do is this gap entry, they felled all the culls and are leaving the cull as dead wood, not a bad idea. They're leaving a legacy tree as a future source of dead wood. If that's all I do in that stand ever, I've kind of created this kind of single note or single flavor of dead wood that over time as it develops certainly is important, but I'm not creating that variability across that stand that really characterizes old forest. So multiple entries with multiple inputs of dead wood is critical. Getting into maybe some more firm ground for all of us, if we want to create that vertical canopy stratification, that horizontal variation in stem densities, the regeneration methods that we use and have relied upon really are well suited for achieving this. And so, given that natural disturbance regime, given what we know about old forests in the region, these were multi-age forests, right? They're 3 or more age classes. They weren't balanced. They were very irregular, but they were multi-age forests. And so today in Vermont, primarily, and really throughout much of the Northeast, if not the eastern forest, we're starting from a largely even-aged, if not slightly two-age condition. And so what we need to do, if our goal is to kind of restore and accelerate this attribute of vertical canopy stratification and horizontal variation, we need to kind of both introduce, in some cases where it doesn't exist, but also build from spatial heterogeneity in that stand by using multi-age regeneration methods. So certainly more traditional uneven age approaches like group and patch selection, as well as uneven age, two-age and multi-aged shelterwood approaches like expanding gap and continuous cover regular shelterwoods. And a big guide for this, knowing kind of the natural disturbance regimes, is that we're trying to emulate, with these methods, kind of the range of natural canopy sizes. So if we're using more of a gap-based approach, things, 10th acre, half acre gaps, kind of within that realm that we know are pretty typical and fairly frequent, in these stands, but also not forgetting that old forest did develop with these mesoscale events that might, blow down 1 to 3 acres with lots of things surviving, but nevertheless had a bigger footprint than just a tree fall gap. And so those are also equally important to emulate in these ecosystems if our goal is to truly restore kind of old forest conditions, including the compositional conditions that existed out there. So a way I like to think about this, is that we again need to reprogram some aspects of our silviculture to manage for this. And in particular, a lot of our approaches, whether it's thinning and even some of our regeneration methods, really emphasize trying to kind of create and maintain uniformity in condition, kind of wall-to-wall stocking of highly desirable trees, et cetera, in our marking and how we do things. And with managing for old forests, and also I recognize many of us do this already, where we put patches, where we put groups, how we approach a stand, is that we're looking at that irregularity and working with it. And so with managing for this vertical canopy stratification and horizontal variation, we want to introduce some of this irregularity with our marking. And so to highlight that just with some data in terms of kind of what that looks like, and then show an example on the right in terms of what that plays out in kind of a hardwood stand. What you're looking at here, this is from the Pacific Northwest. And this is they've mapped all the stems in this forest and measured the diameter. And so the darker the color, kind of the higher the density of big trees, right? So again, if you didn't believe me already, it's not wall-to-wall big trees, even in the Pacific Northwest. What you're seeing are these groups of, of that stand. These are the places that certainly I would take the picture of my son to really make the trees look giant, right? And I of course would take pictures of them next to the logs over here too. But what we're seeing here is kind of that variability in large trees, but we also see that gappiness in this stand across that site. On the right is actually a 50-year-old Douglas fir stand that was just treated with variable density thinning. Right? And so what you're looking at here, these are what they would call a patch kind of reserves, the areas they decided not to treat at all. These are the gaps they created in that stand. And then kind of the lighter colors of gray are where they did some kind of level of crop tree or thinning in between. Right? So they've kind of created in a very uniform condition, all of a sudden this quite heterogeneous condition in the landscape. And it looks, with a grid fairly artificial, right? You just put it wherever, but obviously, using your intuition as a forester, like where does it make sense to kind of put in a patch reserve? Where does it make sense to put in a group? Where does it make sense to thin? But doing kind of this complex marking in a small area to almost create these micro stands, for lack of a better term, that we're managing in that element to create that complexity. And so on the right, what you're looking at is a large northern hardwood block, it's 50 acres, where basically the initial entry is really trying to generate this multi-age irregular structure, kind of set that stand on a trajectory that will over future entries allow it to kind of gain kind of more old forest characteristics. But the first entry in the stand really is kind of focusing on making sure there's still a fairly significant mid-tolerant and an intolerant component in that stand by emulating kind of a downburst type event in portions. So we have these 1 and 3 acre openings where there's a heavy level of retention, right? 40 to 60 square feet being retained. So think of these as almost micro shelter woods. And these trees can certainly be, felled later on to kind of further develop, yellow birch in those areas. But initially kind of being created as we would expect kind of a downburst event to create. in between those areas. So those that have been worried about that residual stocking in those areas in between these openings, yes, we're carrying 80 to 90 square feet, but the overall stand basal area is likely more close to 60 to 70 square feet. And then also designating areas that we're not going to touch, right? There's already unique attributes there. Let's allow those to kind of stay protected and be a portion of that mosaic over time as that stand develops. So if we take all of those different components, large tree encouragement, deadwood creation, managing for vertical complexity, I kind of break our active old forest management approaches into two kind of general categories, right? And for lack of better terms, and I guess I realize this is like it could be from an infomercial for like the Instant Pot or something, set it and forget it. But the one approach that we can use is one that's often been recommended as it relates to, this is an area that we're going to protect. It's a natural area. We're not viewing it for timber production. We really want to restore old forest conditions, but we're really not going to allow re-entry into the stand. So I call it kind of the set it and forget it approach, where you take a single entry, you go into that stand and you kind of put that stand on a trajectory that's going to allow it to at least achieve some attributes of old forest fairly rapidly, or more rapidly than they would if they just were to do passive management in that place, right? And so just to illustrate that, kind of diagrammatically, this is from that Bauhu's paper, which is a really nice review of kind of managing for old growth like features. And what they have here is, let's just say this, we're interested in large old trees, right? So that's our y-axis here. And so historically, under the natural range of variation, we know, again, notice it's not a constant. There was kind of a range of abundance of large trees, but it was a pretty high level, right? So this happens to be from some authors that work in the Pacific Northwest. So they're thinking about you clear cut the old growth, obviously not happening in Vermont or much of Oregon even. And we basically completely eliminate that big, large live tree component. And it's going to take a long time. This is kind of the natural development of that component to come back, right? We can do what's pretty typical in that landscape and retain some trees, right? So we have some mature trees left in the landscape, and they kind of sustain that mature component for a while, but then they ultimately die, and it takes a while again to regain that. Or we can intervene at some point in time and do kind of this set it and forget it type approach, where we kind of enhance the structure of that stand, kind of put it on a trajectory, and then are able to achieve kind of a higher level of old forest condition in a much shorter period of time, right? And so in our ecosystems, it might be some combination of small group selection, crop tree release, get some cohorts going, get some large trees developing, fell some wood, either as well as basically girdle some trees for snags. But the intent is that you're not going to go back to out in that stand again. And in some cases, certainly in some natural areas management in the lake states, they haven't even removed trees in this initial entry. Basically, everything's being felled and left, right? So this is an investment in some cases, whereas it can be economical, but nevertheless kind of the one-shot deal to kind of push that stand along a trajectory. So certainly valid and quite useful. The one issue I have with it, and again, it's my own bias and wiring as a silviculturist, is that we kind of know what the desired future condition is. We want old forest. We know those old forests really had this mosaic of age classes. We know those old forests had things like yellow birch in them, kind of a diversity of canopy trees. And we also know those old forests had kind of this range of decay classes, in these punctuated pulses of deadwood over time. And so this approach, even though it's going to get us some of these structural components, it's not going to allow us definitely to maintain less tolerant tree species over time if we're not kind of at least minding kind of their abundance, because we know many of these stands are going to trend hard towards sugar maple on good sites and trend hard towards beech on less productive sites and fir if you're in the kingdom. And so really trying to think about how do we use regeneration methods over time to keep those components. And so my biased perspective is that why not use an ecological silvicultural system? Why not think about my end goal is to take this suite of structural and compositional attributes that I'm interested in, and I want to use my best understanding of natural disturbance dynamics, natural structural development, to really inform a long-term series of treatments that's really going to allow me to kind of sustain that. And that's not for every landowner, it's not for every ownership, but nevertheless, it's worth thinking about the long term. Like, how do I, after that initial treatment, really think about enhancing both what I created at initial treatment as well as kind of further encouraging the development of other factors. And so what I'm describing is an ecological silvicultural system similar to a traditional silvicultural system. It's a sequence of treatments, but really the emphasis is on restoring, maintaining, and enhancing kind of that compositional diversity, ecological complexity, and heterogeneity. All attributes that many of us view as pretty positive. And so in the context of these systems, that initial entry, right, we're trying to take this even age stand, right? So we have kind of a diagrammatic, of kind of Vermont's forest, the artist rendering. And in that initial entry, we are trying to introduce some of that complexity, right? So we're creating cohorts, we're creating dead wood, we're doing it across the stand, we're also doing crop tree release, we're really starting to accelerate that dead wood component. But kind of viewing that as kind of as one of many stages that will ultimately get us towards that multi-cohort condition. And so, using regeneration methods, primarily, irregular shelterwood types of approaches, but also certainly some hybrid single tree group selection could also make this work. So 15 years later, going into that system and making a decision, right? Do I expand upon kind of those initial gaps, and that puts me into kind of my expanding gap regular shelterwood, or do I freely mark additional gaps in that stand, which would push me more towards continuous cover regular shelterwood? Regardless, I'm recognizing that, if this was a natural system, with mature trees and large trees, we would have canopy gaps occurring in 10 to 20% of the area every decade. And so I'm trying to kind of introduce some of that complexity, but by frequent disturbances, and introducing not only kind of the cohorts, but also things like dead wood in those entries, and trying to kind of create that complexity. And so over time, I'm getting kind of more of that mosaic where, yes, I have big old trees that are growing out there, but I have kind of that range of conditions, that horizontal complexity that's much more analogous with old growth than just wall-to-wall big trees, right? It's just not a condition that we found at stand or landscape scales. Again, you can put your plots in a condition like this and say this is the world, but we know it's not, right? It's just kind of one slice of that part of the landscape. So the advantages, again, from my bias perspective, of doing this type of approach is that, it's going to create those conditions. We were taking a desired future condition, and we're using our understanding of ecological silviculture to get there. And as a result, because it's a silvicultural system, it's meant to be a working hypothesis that we're adapting to conditions. And so we're not saying, this site is restored and on its way to old growth. We're recognizing we need to observe and adjust, including to things like insects and disease, climate change, changing objectives, et cetera. And so there's an advantage of looking at this as a long-term opportunity. The disadvantage, and many of you today are already wondering, who's going to be giving out the loans for old forest management. It's already a system that's not maximizing profit. And so if we have multiple entries scheduled over time for these areas, making sure you do have the volumes to carry that, or maybe some new cost share programs that will help enhance aspects of this. But nevertheless, those multiple entry components certainly create some challenges from an operational standpoint, as well as dealing with multiple entries and the impact to some of these elements that we're trying to protect, like old logs and old trees and things that we want to kind of minimize damage to. So in terms of thinking about this at kind of the local and then kind of regional scale in planning, and I'll wrap it up in a second here. Those that want to go back to reading damning articles about the Bruins and their underperformance. I guess I didn't get my mind fully off that, but anyhow, when we're looking at a stand, working with a landowner, we're looking at public lands and thinking about where does it make sense to manage for old forest. As much as I have in some cases pigeonholed Vermont's forests, that they're not very complex and not very old, there are parts of our forests that are, right? Natural disturbance, your management, other things have created fine scale and sometimes even stand scale features that are representative of old forest, right? And so this is a pretty vanilla forest in the bottom left-hand corner near where I live, but all it took was one May microburst, and that stand now has a pretty complex section of it that if I'm managing for old forest, this would make sense to be a patch reserve. I'm not going to go in there and salvage. Basically, I'm getting a nice pulse of dead wood naturally created for me, and so kind of putting kind of small aggregate around there. And that kind of protects those elements and protects that functioning. Likewise, there might be large trees out there that are cull individuals that just make perfect sense, and so working with those. The other part of this is that kind of our traditional approach to old forest has been, well, the areas that we can't cut are going to be where the old forest exists, and so why are we even talking about this today? Go above a certain elevation, and we're going to have plenty of old forest, and really we want to be representing kind of the full range of forest conditions in Vermont. And as a result, we don't want to just restrict this to areas where economics weren't the objective, right? And as much as it might pain some folks, really the places where we can achieve old forest most quickly, because really what we're doing is manipulating tree growth, are those places where we have better quality. And so the reason why Those that have been to Cambridge and looked at the Cambridge pines, or those that have been to Mohawk Trail State Forest and seen those giant white pine in that small area, those are amazing soils, right? And because of that, you can get big trees fast, or even think of just the size of an ash in a rich pocket. I mean, they get big fast in those places. Obviously, those are also the places you might think of being most productive for timber, but evaluating those trade-offs. And finally, just in terms of using judgment as around old forest, again, I'm not telling anything new. It's like any silvicultural system and any objective, you can't achieve it everywhere. And so there's going to be places, again, I guess I'm going back to picking on beech. In the stand here, there's just not a lot of options, for legacy retention, creation of large trees in this ecosystem. And so that might be an area where regeneration harvest with some retention might make sense, but not an area where it's going to be easy to credibly say that is going to become similar to what we would assume old forests look like prior to our management of beech bark disease happening out there. And then just a plug for Vermont conservation design, and just thinking at the landscape scale in general, we know these are rare features. We know they are a pretty dominant feature in the landscape. So anywhere we can use management at the stand and property scale that ties into both kind of state level, biophysical region level planning around natural forest, the better. And I think the biggest concern is that we're only going to do this in northern hardwoods, but really trying to represent kind of all those communities that are on the landscape. So not just northern hardwood systems. My final comment before we get into before I wrap this up is that I talked about old forest and as I today, but there are lots of things that we can do that we can integrate into other areas that are being managed, but not for old forest, that really build upon our understanding of the fact that old forest, and in particular old big trees and old big dead trees, were a pretty common part of Vermont's landscape prior to massive land use clearing and all that happened to it. And so even if you're not doing old forest management, so this nice this is nice early successional habitat, the canopy cover here, you're still going to get shrubland birds in this ecosystem, but leaving these trees behind to live out their lifespan, kind of large big trees, takes a long time to create those. And so leaving trees behind in general, where you can, even if it's just a few scattered trees, is really critical for us to get some of those legacies that are quite important. And again, those that are getting heartburn, well, no, I'm not going to be able to regenerate anything but beech. Plan your environment accordingly. If you make the patch bigger, but retain in it, and make sure that you have that material out there. So to close here, I think we all recognize we're dealing with climate urgency here. We want big trees out there, sucking up carbon, and more importantly, doing what they do best, which is storing carbon. And so we need to be thinking about old forests, and people are. And there's a reason why I guess I'm talking today is that it's certainly something that is being discussed quite a bit in Vermont and elsewhere. But I really would argue that those that are saying really the best course forward is just to lock up Vermont's forests and leave it alone. And that's how we're going to get there. Really ignore, number one, just an understanding of basic stand dynamics and how long it takes for a forest to get to those old conditions from where they're at today. But also, again, that notion that we should be the state that rewilds and everywhere else should be the place that carries our lunch in terms of wood production is quite, I think, short-sighted and quite selfish, to be honest, if we're going to be true global citizens dealing with climate change. And so, using active management to create old forests, we're securing some wood products, but we're also actually, accelerating that timeline to get to some of those conditions that we're after. And so getting people to really get on board with this idea of active old forest management is going to be this tension between some that are viewing old forest as the way to stop management, right? We want old forest, and so the best thing to do is to get people out of there. And so getting people to understand that, you can manage in an ecologically sound way that will actually accelerate the development of these structures and actually allow us to achieve some of these goals that might not be achieved in our lifetime with passive management. And on the flip side, really, many of us that may have been trained that you shouldn't let that tree die in the woods. You shouldn't let a tree have be out there past its max diameter. How could we not think we should manage every acre? We really know that, we should be leaving things behind. We should be leaving things out there, particularly if we want old forest in the landscape. And so we definitely want to have that balance across the landscape where certainly we're protecting areas, we're actively kind of promoting old forests, and then across other areas, kind of these shades of green going from kind of pure protection to active old forest management to kind of more extensive management. Across all of these, there's some element, whether it's just leaving big trees behind, that are restoring what really was a pretty dominant condition across Vermont. All right, so I'll close with that and certainly take any questions, including what moves Bruins need to make in the off season. But maybe we can stick to more positive things like Deadwood, and appreciate people's attention this morning. You're muted, Keith, actually.
Sorry about that, everybody. Made an announcement. Hopefully folks see it. On the right-hand side of your screen, there should be a couple of speech bubbles. One has a question mark. That's the Q&A section. And now's the time for a few questions. So please post them into the question and answer section. We'll take a look at those and send those to Tony. So start sending them in, please. All right. Tony, I'm going to put you up here and start peppering you with some questions, if you don't mind.
Okay.
All right. We've got one from Silas. Deer browse is making it hard to regenerate anything other than beech. I think in the context of this presentation, what do you do?
Yeah, and I think in some cases you hopefully can use aspects of that morticulture to your advantage in terms of when you're creating gaps, kind of the notion of creating messy gaps that might minimize aspects of that. And I would certainly put in a plug. Tip-up mounds do create an elevated microsite. Not always predictable how those will play out over time for producing kind of a stable tree, but nevertheless those are also some ways that folks think about that. But yeah, browse is a huge issue, and again I think gets at some of the challenges when we talk about kind of passive management, and that being the only way to get to these old forest conditions. And so where you have heavy browse, if you're able to drop trees, and that picture I showed of those trees that were kind of bucked up into lengths as a part of morticulture, that was really a communication issue. That's some work that Paul Catanzaro and I did in the logger on that job, being a good logger, bucked up all the trees, even the ones we want them to leave. But kind of being able to leave and fell that whole crown into a gap, creating that complex structure that really is not going to be desirable. And also, I think, when we talk about emulating natural disturbances in wind, if we're trying to recruit something like yellow birch in a stand that's got a heavy beech component, we know, it was that exposed mineral soil as well as well decomposed dead wood substrate that was critical for it. And so creating gaps that are being done, summer, fall, but when you're felling kind of those legacy trees, that morticulture kind of felling those crowns into the gap to kind of create that mess that might minimize browse issues, which you don't want to resurvey, but that also means hopefully something with 4 legs doesn't want to go in there either.
Great, thank you. Ed Larson asked if we published a new definition for old growth forest in the UVA standards. Ed, I will post the link to the revision to the ESTA standards that was shared, I think a month ago or so. I'll share that back out here. Sam asks, have there been any studies looking at soil compaction, harvest systems, and impacts on old forest development?
Yeah, I mean, I think we recognize that with any harvest, there's going to be some disturbance that we can control, and some that's going to that occasionally might, especially with our current highly unpredictable weather, that occasionally will arise. But yeah, there's definitely been some work. And Tom Steele is a gentleman that did this work primarily in Wisconsin. They did large old forest restoration projects. They both looked at residual damage as well as soil damage and kind of area and trails and so forth. And it was very comparable to work that was done with single tree selection, kind of the levels that you're seeing out there, with a typical harvest. And I think the biggest challenge, kind of as I mentioned, with the re-entries, and so in this case, sorry, you're asking about they looked at both kind of hand crews, so of course kind of lowest impact, but also there was some work that I was looking at, some work that was done with a fixed head processor, in a stand. And so, a little bit bigger equipment, and both had pretty similar conclusions that whether this was for old growth management or for, single tree selection, kind of traditional management, there was no kind of difference in the level of damage observed. But nevertheless, when we're talking about trying to grow like large trees and then they die and have kind of, well decayed wood out there, you're trying to minimize damage to like crushing that and so forth can be a bit tricky. And so I think, one positive, as much as when folks see like, oh, we want to manage for spatial complexity and map all these things, and with each growing day, as I work with the Venza and other kind of handheld tablet type, marking tools and mapping tools, kind of the ability to document and even think about harvest layout to minimize impact where you can to some of those features is becoming much easier, thanks to the work happening in the state and elsewhere on that. But to your original question, the work that's compared kind of old forest management with kind of traditional silvicultural systems has shown no difference. In some cases, sometimes less damage because you're sometimes cutting and felling trees, to get at some of the trees you're after versus trying to work around them depending on the prescription.
Great, thank you. I'm going to bounce around so we touch on what I know are some really big issues confronting foresters. And Aaron Hurst asked, are there modifications for developing old forest conditions given the threats from invasive exotic plants?
So from my perspective, again, this gets into the realm of what is our desired condition here? Do we want old forests that look like 1420, or do we want old forests that kind of contain the current century and all the threats that it has in it? And so there's a critical break point there in that, whether it's passive management or active management, if our goal is to really recreate what we kind of view as these exemplary old growth systems, there's going to need to be a heavy investment in places where there's invasives to kind of keep those out of that system, to minimize their impact on that development. And so, so one approach is kind of that resist change and really fight it. And I think, me, just from a personal belief standpoint, that's kind of where I fall. But but from a reality standpoint, there are going to be some places where it's going to be quite challenging to do. And so when it comes to prioritizing, invasive removal, and if there's an area that really is serving a critical function as an old forest, maybe prioritizing those are the places where we, are putting in all of our best effort to control, and other places we do the best we can. But unfortunately, I feel like it's naive to assume we can, as much as I'd love to. But I live in Chittenden County. How can I keep invasives at every square acre of this forest? Even through my best efforts in my backyard, they're still there. And so, trying to at least kind of prioritize where it happens, and also what we're willing to accept over time, as kind of that resistance to to their invasion gets harder and harder. But I think we need to factor these in, and even including the impacts of hemlock woolly adelgid and impacts of emerald ash borer. I mean, these are all going to create some novel dynamics, some of which are going to generate some of the structures we're interested in, but certainly are also going to deviate from what we viewed as like the classic old growth condition in these areas.
All right. I think this is one a lot of folks wrestle with, and I think it's a matter of scale. Peter Kondaxis asks, is there a minimum percentage or acreage of a given property that should be managed for old growth so that it has an actual impact on future stand conditions?
Yeah, that's hard. I mean, I think we often, the annoying response is bigger is better because it allows kind of natural processes to play throughout. At the same token, given how little we have, both of old forest-like conditions and those structures, even a 25, 50 acre area where you're thinking about doing this, obviously the key breakpoints there are that if you're going to do this over time, and want to make it economically viable over time, and you're being told by me, and if you buy into it, you got to leave a lot behind, you got to fell a lot of those trees over time and leave them, is there enough volume to carry that, with that minimum level, that might be a break point on scale there from an economic standpoint. But in terms of, ecological value, even a 25 acre area being approached this way, if that gets leveled tomorrow by, a downburst, if your goal was to create old forest conditions at this point, you're like, well, I'm going to do limited salvage in that stand and take advantage of that deadwood that's out there and work with that parcel very differently than other portions of that area. To me, it's still a nudge towards that old forest and complex kind of young forest with these old forest attributes introduced into it that we don't have in the landscape. So I would still stick with, any is good, bigger is better. But, I think the biggest breakpoint will be if there's an economic, or even if there isn't, can the person pay for all the treatments over time over large acreages or not? That'll be, I think, a critical decision. And so 25 to 50 acres might be where you have the economics to carry it over multiple entries.
Great. Thank you. I think there's more than we can ask here, and sorry everybody. I think what we'll do is we'll take these down and make sure that there's a way to begin to address these this is a really great conversation that isn't going to stop here. I think maybe one way to end this, how does currently unmanaged private land in Vermont play into this landscape level goal? Should we be trying to engage with all landowners to make sure that no management is a choice, not a default, because of lack of understanding of forest dynamics?
Yeah, I think, and I guess my first entry into the active management for old forest was in Massachusetts, where at the time there was tremendous engagement with family forest owners around early successional habitat. Again, another challenge for some to want to manage for, and there's kind of this class of individuals that, well, I just want old forest, I'm not going to do anything, and they weren't fully reflecting on, like, what is your forest like today? It's a 70-year-old old field pine stand, or it's our classic nice sugar maple stand, but with not much going on in terms of structural complexity and so forth. And so if the goal is to see old growth and to be kind of part of kind of restoring that much more rapidly, that would occur over the next 100 years or so, I think there is an opportunity for more engagement. And we're working on kind of a reboot of the Managing for Old Forest or Old Growth pamphlet we did, I guess over a decade ago, with that emphasis, particularly now with folks kind of viewing using carbon as a key argument, getting people to understand more of the nuance on that, but also that there's elements of old forest, even from a carbon standpoint, that we can actively manage for, and that doing nothing and is not kind of the only way, and in some cases might be the least productive way, depending on that stand condition. So again, I have a bias, from where I sit, that I think we can do some good things with management, but we can also do a lot of good things without managing too. So kind of balancing that across the landscape is pretty critical.
Great. Thank you so much, Tony. I'll close it out here for a second. Again, thanks, Tony, for the presentation. I know that everybody who joined us really enjoyed it, got a lot of positive comments. So thanks for that. And I also want to acknowledge that there were some other questions that we weren't able to get to, related to, how might some of these recommendations change if we're talking about spruce fir forests? Questions about articulating some of this stuff in terms of silvicultural prescriptions, like how do we define a rotation age or cutting cycles or things like that? And these are really good questions. Acknowledgement from Eric Sorensen, the appreciation of the importance of balancing between permanently protecting some old forest and a need and desire to manage much of the forest land. So it'll be an ongoing conversation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, particularly Tony, for just an incredibly thoughtful, thorough presentation, which is, I couldn't have hoped for more. So thank you for that. And I'll be sharing this link out with folks once it goes live. And again, I'll send out certificates for SAF credits. And I think we'll wrap it up at that. If folks have other questions for me, feel free to send them my way by email or give me a call. Thanks again, everybody. Thanks for taking a sunny Thursday morning to join us for this.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.